What's up, guys? Happy Tuesday. Welcome back to another episode of Eat, Train, Prosper. Today, Bryan and I are going to dig into an interesting topic that was proposed. And the topic is, when coaching clients, how do we account for these three components? Evidence-based, personal preference, and anecdote. Do we split them into equal thirds, or do we put more credence into one or the other? So it's a really cool, interesting thing that Bryan and I think are going to have a lot of similarities, but I think even some parts where we will differ a little bit as well, which is always great for productive conversation. But before we get into this, we have some exciting updates for Bryan, specifically around the end of his diet. So Bryan, kick us off, please.
Yeah, today's the last day. We're doing a photo shoot here in 4 hours. So literally 4 hours after this recording, I'll be like standing in front of some mountains with some really small shorts on and doing the flex thing. So I've been up since 4:30 this morning, kind of just woke up to use the bathroom and started thinking about things, and had to be up early for the podcast anyway, you know? So it's one of those things where it's like, do I go back to sleep for another 30 minutes? Is it worth it type thing? I just woke up and weighed in for the final time. And man, the scale is just so weird sometimes. So I'm going to run you guys through this little, the history of the last couple weeks here. So throughout the diet, I was eating, the last couple weeks, I'm eating 2,300 calories a day. Say I just go to 2,600 or 2,700, just a 300 or 400 extra, not a big deal. Almost like clockwork, the scale jumps 2 or 3 pounds the next day. And then it takes a few days for it to kind of work itself back down again. Over the last 3 days, I've gone from 2,300 calories to last night I had 3,400 calories. So progressively I've been adding carbs each day. And yesterday, I had 450 carbs, which was over 200 more than where I was 3 days prior. And the scale literally hasn't moved. It's half a pound up from where it was 3 days ago. So it's just there's a number of potential ideas in my brain, like flushing of stress, the fact that I haven't really trained in a few days. I also think there's probably a delayed effect where I had pushed really hard the last 5 or 6 days to deplete as much as I could going into kind of this loading phase, but the scale wasn't acknowledging that I was doing this. And so it's very possible that the scale is now acknowledging that. It's just kind of being blurred by the fact that I'm also eating a bunch more food. So the numbers staying more or less the same. But a number of reasons. And I just find it super interesting because it's like what you hear in reverse diets, but I was actually worried that I was going to come into this photo shoot heavier than in prior years because the way the scale was kind of being sticky the last couple of weeks and stuff like that. But I'm actually lower today than I was either of the last 2 years. So the first year I was 186 flat. Last year I was 185.6. And today I was 185.0. So half a pound less each year. And the other interesting thing is that my lowest low for this whole diet was 183.2, which is 0.4 pounds above last year. I know I'm throwing out all these numbers, so it's probably silly for people to follow. But essentially, I think it's funny that the lowest I got this time was 183.2, which is, half a pound up from where I was last time, because that's probably about how much muscle I gained this last year. So when you think about it in those terms, it's man, I got stuck at 182.8 and I just couldn't get lower last year. And now it's 183.2 and just couldn't get lower. So maybe I'm just half a pound of muscle bigger right now. And that is the way things are in life these days, Any thoughts on that?
I do have thoughts, of course. But what I really think is now where you is the most cool part about this is we have 3 years. We're coming into this day within pretty much a pound to a pound and a half sort of thing. And I just think it's really, really cool because now we get to see hey, the variables for these pictures are very well regulated. So it's not oh, this photo shoot's at 190 pounds and this one's at 178. And we're oh yeah, well, no shit, but each photo shoot is going to be approximately plus or minus 185 pounds by a pound, more or less. And that's really, really cool to be like, okay, we can clearly see changes and improvements in physique, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep. And it's same time of the day. And the first 2 years were same time of the year. But this one is obviously, 2 or 3 months earlier because of how I commenced the diet earlier. But yeah, no, I'm really excited about it. I think that it is going to go pretty well. And then I have one other piece of interesting tidbit on the nutrition side, and it is that yesterday I was only planning on doing 400 carbs, which still seems like a pretty big number. But like literally every time I ate carbs, I would go for like a short walk, kind of facilitate the glucose uptake, and it really made a difference. Like I felt like, eating carbs, and instead of feeling full, going for a walk, I could almost feel them and see them disperse into my body throughout the walk. And my body just absorbed them all up. I almost couldn't believe it because last year, and even like when I would test this out throughout the diet, if I did something like this where I would have 400, 450 carbs, man, I would go to bed just bloated and puffy and watery. And I'd be like, hey, it's cool because, I'll wake up and it will have all kind of worked itself out and it's not a big deal. But I would go to bed, just looking awful. That didn't happen yesterday. I literally absorbed every single one of those 450 carbs, and my physique looked phenomenal last night going to bed. It made me like regretful that I didn't schedule that photo shoot for like 7 p.m. with like a fake light coming in at me or something, because it was like next level. I even had veins in my legs that I never get veins in my legs. Like I had cross veins in like 7 different places in my biceps. And now I'm flat as shit because I just woke up in the morning and I have none of that anymore. So my challenge today is to try to recreate what happened yesterday. So my plan is essentially right now I have a whey and Gatorade right here. I've already had some Element this morning, and I'm just going to keep pumping stuff like that, as well as rice cakes, corn checks, whatever sort of like starchy carbohydrates I can get into my body. And I only have now at this point 3.5 hours before the photo shoot. So that's my plan. Do you have any suggestions or ways that I could potentially do that a little bit better, or does that sound pretty good?
You do want a little bit of fructose as well. Don't completely avoid it 100%, but you do want overwhelmingly majority of, what is it? Glucose, right? So
glucose,
starch-based,
yeah.
But you do want some fructose as well.
Sweet.
And I would aim higher than lower based on how you woke up today. Mm-hmm. If you woke up super flat, you have I think I saw a note here in our document that you were going to have like 3 or 4 rice cakes. Like you might want to turn that into like 15 to 20 rice cakes.
I mean, there are 20 grams of carbs in each one though. There's 20 carbs in each one.
I would go into the shoot at least 250 grams of carbs on the day.
Okay. That's a lot for 3 hours. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I'm going to have to make sure I move a lot with that too, because if I don't move, I know my body's going to hold that and it's not going to look good. But if I can kind of keep walking around or light general movement, then I think it'll facilitate that distribution a little bit better.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just know like it is much less common that someone comes in like spilled as opposed to under carbed. It's a very interesting time frame phenomena of getting really lean, loading carbs, and your body just does things with them. It's very cool, but it can be frustrating because like every photo shoot I've done personally, like 3 or 4 days later, I wake up and I'm like, what the hell? Like,
because you look better a few days later. Yeah.
After like you have like, okay, I did the photo shoot, right? Like nerves are down. You have like a handful of meals that are untracked, that are high. I might have some candy or something like that. Maybe some like drinks that are containing carbohydrate and stuff. You have like a couple days off planned, and obviously your carbs are significantly higher. And then you wake up one day and you look like an anime superhero, and you're like, motherfucker.
That was me last night, dude. I was literally like, man, you just cannot feed this dude enough carbs right now. The one thing I'll bring up that I think is interesting too, and maybe you have insight on this, is I don't want to call it like a pooch in the stomach because I'm like 8 to 10% body fat, so I don't have like a pooch. But sometimes I will eat, not even overeat, just eat. And I'm guessing it's like, certain foods that maybe I don't tolerate as well or whatever. But then I'll go for a walk and I'll see my reflection in the car window or something along those lines. And I'll notice that I'm super, super flat up until my belly button. And then from the belly button to like the waist of my pants, it's just like slightly protruded, right? Do you know anything about that? Like, is that like a food intolerance thing, or what does that speak to?
Do you know what organ is right underneath your belly button?
Enlighten me.
It's your small intestine.
Okay.
It's your small intestine. It is very likely that something you are getting some, I don't want to call it bacteria overgrowth, but you are getting a gas byproduct of something that the bacteria is feeding on and producing a little bit of bloating in the form of gas in there. That is, I'd put like 9 out of 10. That's likely what's going on. It is common. This is something I wish I knew why this actually happened. It's not something I've just learned yet in my coaching journey. It is very common for digestive intolerances to develop on the tail end of diets. If you remember back when I was finishing up mine, like in like a little bit less than a year ago, like August, September, just kind of overnight, a bunch of GI issues at the end of my diet. And then that's when I went through like that SIBO protocol and stuff like that through the fall, and why we went super high fat and carbs came down, because carbohydrate are going to ferment, or I should say they have much higher probability of fermenting in the small intestine, where opportunistic bacteria can feed on them and produce the byproduct of gas, which you get that bloating right at the belly button.
Very interesting. I knew it was like something like that. I'd heard similar like rumblings, but that's good to actually kind of hear it broken down like that. I'm sure the listeners will get something out of that too. Let's jump into some of your updates, and then we'll come back to me for some training stuff.
Yeah, so I completed my first full week of my metabolic phase with Alex, and I can confirm that I do not like it.
How long was it?
This is just, first full, so it was five training sessions. Okay. And then we will do this for at least 3 weeks. I just did the first day of week 2 today. Painful pumps, and just like endurance wise, like I'm not built for endurance, and I don't train it or anything like that. So it's a lot of, everything is 30 or 40 seconds rest. The leg days are brutal, right? Like I always think, man, I just want like sick, hamstring and quad pumps, until you get them and you're like, these feel fucking terrible. Please stop. Especially like one after the other. Like once you have a gnarly hamstring pump and then you go onto like the seated leg extension, or vice versa, right? You have to shove your pumped quads into the the seated leg curl. It feels terrible. Mm-hmm.
So are you doing antagonistic all sets right now? So you're kind of going like leg extension, rest 30 seconds, leg curl, rest 30 seconds?
No, they're not supersets, thank God. It'll be like 30 seconds into the same, so it's
like the IRM method, the sets of 8 reps type thing. So it's a local metabolic phase. You're not in systemic metabolic.
Correct. Yeah. Everything we're doing is 5 sets of 10 right now.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's been, I wanted to learn, right, and just go through these, because if I'm being super, super transparent, I did have this note for last week, but we didn't end up getting to it. One way that I know with myself, a way for me to do things I don't necessarily want to do, is to pay for them. And out of principle, because I am paying Alex and he's saying, hey, Aaron, we are doing this training, I will do it because I am spending the money on it. But if I were to like write this program for myself and go through like the first 3 days, I would be like, fuck this, and then go right back to what I like doing. But because I'm paying someone, I'm going to follow it and not be like, oh yeah, I know I paid you to coach me, but I'm going to go do what I want to anyway. Like I would never do that. So it's forcing me to do this by way of an investment on it.
Yep, I love that. Well, that's cool. And I mean, you get to now learn something, as you said, and potentially do a type of training that may or may not end up being beneficial for you. But since I Perch Fee is so forgiving, it's not like you're going to go backwards.
Exactly. And one thing that is cool about the second note I have here is we haven't adjusted my macros at all since we started. Well, like week 1, he was like, hey, we're going to start here. And then we've stayed there. And what's been really interesting is like this week's photos that I took yesterday morning, like they don't look I'm like very flat, and like there's not like, you can just tell a noticeable difference than like through like from 2 weeks or even 3 weeks ago. I look significantly better because I'm just like much more fuller and like hard looking. So it's really interesting that after the week of the metabolic, it's just like my body is just running through the glucose more, I guess, per se. That's like a very uneducated way of saying it. But I'm also like, I wouldn't say I'm necessarily like hungrier, but it's much easier to get my food in earlier. Like I've had my final meal at 7 p.m., before I came back to the co-working spot. That is historically unlike Aaron. That means I've had, breakfast, pre-workout meal, lunch 1, intra, post-workout, and then like dinner all by 7 p.m. And historically, that's like a 10 p.m. thing for me.
Yeah. Well, you've shifted your whole day earlier. Don't you work out earlier in the day and stuff like that too?
I'm working out around like noon, 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock. The gym that's when it's dead because everyone's like, it's nice out. The sun's, high noon. Let's go to the beach and stuff. And I'm like, nope, I'm going to the gym because it's empty.
Hell yeah.
Yeah.
Nice.
So that's been cool. What else? Other updates. I finally listened to everyone who has been telling me to increase the price on the Done For You client check-in system, and that will go up July 1st. So now that I'm thinking about it, by the time this episode comes out, that will have gone up. So it's gone up to $99. Right now it's like $67. It's still a crazy steal for the value you get for your coaching business. So you can find that on my website, socials. It's actually in the link on the podcast as well. And that's it, I guess, for the updates for me.
All right, sweet. I have a couple training updates. So I finished 7 microcycles of my training, and that's on the higher end for me. I would say I'm usually between 5 and 8 weeks of training or whatever. So I was definitely ready for a deload. And it kind of is like the episode we had last week where we were talking about the psychological versus physiological need to deload. And I think I probably reached my desire to deload psychologically the week before, if I would have been honest with myself, because I was in this diet. I just knew that I wanted to coordinate the end of it with, a few days of deload before the photo shoot. And you get this like weird adrenaline, like hyper focus thing when you're pursuing something, So it was really easy for me to push that psychological fatigue back and just commit my mind to the fact that I had another week. And despite that, I progressed, and almost every single movement progressed somehow in the last week of my diet. So I think that for me, at least, further speaks to our discussion last week around how physiologically, you almost will never have like a backslip in performance. It'll mostly just be like a psychological desire that you just don't really want to do it anymore. And so that's where I found myself at the end of this week, after the 7th microcycle. I have now taken, this is day 5 of not training, and I did 1 deload session on Saturday. It was just an upper body antagonist paired superset thing. Super easy, and it took me 35 minutes. So I've trained for 35 minutes in the last 5 days, which feels amazing. And I also will say that like things like I'll be downstairs playing with with Bryson or the kids, and where a week ago I wouldn't have even wanted to like get up and chase the ball that was thrown at me. Now I like pop up off the ground and I'm like ready to go to get after the ball. So it's funny how you can get these signs of fatigue that you actually notice in your life. And I wouldn't have even correlated that fatigue to training until like literally this moment when I was playing with him and I jumped right up. I wouldn't have been like, oh, I must have been like so fatigued from all that training I was doing. It would have just been like, oh, I'm tired. I didn't sleep well. Like I'm on a diet, like all these things, you know, but it really was that I had kind of trained myself into this relatively fatigued state. So anyways, that's neither here nor there. I'm on like basically what is a 9-day deload protocol here. And then I'm moving into my new mesocycle. And I have decided to make a couple small changes. Mostly exercise selection is going to stay the same. But through analyzing my physique, and I've taken a bunch of pictures of myself as I've been trying to like learn to pose a little bit and stuff like that. And I've realized that, as we know, my chest and my lats and most of my upper back rear delts are strong points for me. But I think my front delts are a weak point. And after talking with Abel about this in depth in our chat, he kind of agrees with me. And we've assessed a few different shots, and we started kind of reflecting on the fact that I haven't actually done any incline dumbbell pressing in over a year now. And that used to be a staple movement for me almost ubiquitously across my training career. Like incline dumbbell press was my favorite movement. And since talking to Cass like a year ago and him kind of assessing my incline dumbbell press and basically saying that it was an anterior delt movement, I took it out because I was like, I am using it as a chest movement and I want to put a better chest movement in there. But I think since taking that movement out, despite the fact that I thought it was a chest movement, I think my front delts have actually gotten worse. And I can see that in, Abel pointed it out in my rear double bicep shots, that it's the front delt coming up in the rear double bicep that actually makes that pose really impressive. And I feel like my front delts are now smaller than they were potentially in prior years in that pose. So I am going to add back in an incline dumbbell press, and it's going to probably look like an incline dumbbell bench press to most people. And I am going to more or less think of it as an incline dumbbell anterior delt press. And I'll probably be even more laid back than 60 degrees. It'll probably be more like 45, which is where I usually do an incline dumbbell bench press. So that'll be interesting. I'm kind of excited about that. And then kind of with that, I'm making another small change to facilitate more focus on the front delts. So I'm going to split what was my last upper body day, which was basically like a delt and arm day. I'm going to split that into a delt day and an arm day. And then I'm going to put front delts on the chest lat day. So I have front delts twice. I have them on the delt day, and then I have them on the chest and lat day too. And then because I'm doing that incline dumbbell press on delt day, that will kind of be my like second chest work, even though it's mostly going to be anterior delt work. It'll kind of give me a little bit of chest volume a second time. So yeah, basically chest and lats are going on maintenance volume. Because I'm now extending this microcycle out to 7 days instead of 6 days by splitting up the upper body day, I'm going to make my leg days more well-rounded. So before, where I would have like basically a quad day with a teeny bit of hamstrings and then a hamstring day with a teeny bit of quads, I'm now going to have a ham quad day that's more just like dominant for both. So it's going to be like my RDLs and my hack squats and stuff like that. And then I'm going to have a second leg day that has more of like what I would call the finesse moves. So it would be like leg extensions, leg curls, single leg squats, and hip extensions. So it'll be more of like the short overloaded and or you can't call a single leg squat less damaging, but it's the way I'm going to do it on the pendulum, it's not going to be quite as it would be doing it with like dumbbells and double foot elevated type thing. Anyway, so those are like some small changes to the program, but overall it's mostly going to stay the same. The exercise selection is mostly going to stay the same. And now it's basically a 5-day-a-week program, which I haven't done a calendar week program in a really long time. So I'm not going to, be super strict on being on the calendar. If it becomes 8 days, then that's cool. Like maybe I need 3 rest days that week. And so I'll like that freedom, but I'm excited about these small changes and about instituting incline dumbbell press back into my program again.
Okay, yeah, I was having a hard time unmuting myself. The anterior delt in the back double bicep pose, yes. I recently saw something where it made me realize, like, oh wow, there's some natty dude on Instagram. Like I couldn't remember his name, whatever, but he has like really great anterior delt development.
Yep.
In his back double bicep pose, like he looks like he's on gear because his anterior delts are so big. It's really, really cool. Actually, if I stumble across it again, I'll make sure I send it to you. Maybe I'll post it on the Train Prosper Instagram page for everyone who's listening. We'll see.
Hell yeah.
But yeah, it is something that personally I feel like mine is underdeveloped too, especially compared to my rear delts, which is strange. But I do feel personally I am I'm reaching this point where I have a hard time like mentally detaching from not training body parts. Mm-hmm. But like in the grand scheme of things, like I don't need to train triceps. Like
yeah, you have great triceps.
Of my arm. Yeah, they're literally bigger than my fucking delts. But I have a hard time just not training them from like a principle standpoint. But realistically, I could probably not give them any direct work for like 6 months, and they'll still be bigger than my delts my delts and stuff like that. So that's like one of those things. It's like where you, over a long enough time horizon, when you train into your strengths and the things that you like to do, you end up with these like physique imbalances and sort of things. So in prior episodes, when we talk about like some things don't matter until they do, like this is a really good use case where it does begin to matter, because from a time and recoverability standpoint, I should probably just allocate whatever volume was there to things that are lacking, sort of thing.
Yeah. And I mean, the thing is with triceps is like the medial and the lateral head are going to get worked anytime you do pressing movements. So you like really, really don't have to worry about those if you are a good presser. And even if you tend to be maybe a tricep dominant presser or whatever, like the pressing you do is going to be at least enough for maintenance volume for those. So then it's just a matter of your long head, and shit, the long head even gets work in back movements. So there is like arguments that there's just enough kind of auxiliary volume for it that it could be enough for maintenance volume if that's like a genetically strong muscle group for you.
Yeah, agreed. Anything else you want to touch on with training before we jump into today's topic?
Nah, man, let's do it. Do you want to start? Or I can start if you want.
Yeah, let's have you start. Okay. So we'll kind of reframe it really quickly. So it's basically 3 pillars, right? Of how we approach coaching. We have evidence-based personal preference, which would be like our own personal preference, and then anecdote. And how do we kind of split these? Do we put more favor into one or the other? And then we're just going to talk around some of our thoughts around here, or processes we have, based on, obviously, Bryan is probably going to take things a little bit more from a training standpoint, and then I will take a little bit more from a nutrition standpoint.
Yep, totally. So I will say in starting this conversation that given the like 5 to 6 plus years that I've been pretty tuned in to the evidence-based space and like, the general representation of what the research says, it's probably impossible for me to like ever completely separate that from what's going on in my brain when I think about things. So I'm going to make a statement that I always start with anecdote first for training. And when I say that, that's with that understanding that the backbone of the evidence is just there and I can't like completely separate from that. So when I say that I start with anecdote first, where I'm going with that, and the reason I do that is because when I take on a new client, considering that I mostly work with people that are relatively advanced, the first question that I always ask them is what's worked for you in the past? And then the next one is what hasn't worked for you? Because for somebody with experience, those anecdotes are important. They can tell us so much. And then maybe after you hear these anecdotes, then you can use that bits of pieces of evidence and research that kind of are floating around in your brain to manipulate what they tell you and think about ways in which you could maybe clean that up and, hey, maybe we could change this here or change that there, or whatever. But then personal preference is also huge. So we have this umbrella of hypertrophy training, which we're pursuing. And as we always say, it's this like super forgiving stimulus, right? And you'll see coaches that have created successful athletes, or you've athletes with no coach. And there's people with jacked physiques, everything from I go into the gym and do a bro split where I don't track anything and every set I do is beyond failure, to somebody that does a bro split with 30 sets and nothing's to failure, to the person that does a 2 times a week full body program and is doing basically 5x5 for everything, and then everything in between. And all of these people can have jacked physiques. So when you start looking at personal preference, it is broad, but then it's also can be super specific. It can even get into the framework of like exercise selection and frequency and volume ranges and effort level, how close to failure we're training. All of these can be manipulated, and we're still under this umbrella of, yes, it's evidence-based. So yeah, that's kind of like my general broad strokes thoughts on the training side of this. And then I have a little more, but what do you think of that initially?
Okay, there's a little delay with the clicking the thing, so sorry. I think obviously one thing what I wanted to start on in the beginning is that anecdote is important because the last thing you want is to alienate a brand new client by giving them a bunch of things that they don't want to do, right? And it's the beginning relationship of the coach and the client is, it's really important because you are buying, as a coach, you're buying that client's trust with some of your initial dealings with them and stuff like that. And the last thing you want to do is like, oh, you like high volume? Okay, well, we're going to start with super low volume and everything to like failure or something like that, because you run the risk of the client being like, yeah, I don't like this, I'm out, sort of thing. And you make that trust buy-in thing a little bit harder than it needs to be. So, I definitely agree with that. And again, like you said, it's in the context of hypertrophy, which is generally what we speak most about, it's incredibly forgiving. And what we know is like there's multitude of factors that will make people a little bit more, what's the word I'm looking for? Like better suited to one approach or another, right? So things like training age, right? What their history is like, what other stressors are in their life, right? Their ability to recover. So there's a lot of different things. So it is really, I think with training more so than nutrition, things are more open for that, especially because we know, and this is something that's become rather apparent in earlier this year. So the application of, I shouldn't say the application, some of the research is limited because a lot of things are really subjective around how you define things, especially around failure and those sorts of things. And like you said, this is a note I actually had on mine, but it's a really great one to bring up because you brought it up. The majority of the people you're coaching now are advanced, right? And there is limited research done on your advanced natural bodybuilding competitors, or a population that represents that well. So there's a limited body to directly apply, and based on everything I said around the subjectivity with failure and that sort of thing, it's just there is no clear-cut path from the existing body of research on that population.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it actually brings up another note that I have in here, which is actually kind of about studies specifically. Because so like you said, studies are basically done on novices for the most part. And the reason that they do them on people with a young training age or no training age is because then you get a more dramatic result. Like imagine doing a study on somebody like me or you with 15, 20, 25 years experience training. How long would that training study have to be for us to see anything? I mean, I was in the literally the beginning of this show talking about how, hey, maybe I gained 0.5 pound of muscle this year, you know? So we're part of this like 12-month training study. And at the end, it's like, your cross-sectional area increased by 1 millimeter, or like something along those lines, you know, like it's indetectable how much it changed. It's within the error of a DEXA scan or something along those lines. So then it kind of, because it's done on these novice populations, it essentially shows that everything works. That's what it's showing. It's like, you can do periodization and hey, that works. Or just do not periodization, just do the same thing all the time. That works too. You can train to failure. Hey, that works. Or you could stop 6 or 7 reps shy because, hey, that works too, you know? And so I think it almost creates this like nihilistic attitude that nothing matters, or that like no matter what you do, it will work. But that's clearly not true, because if that was the case, you would have a lot of really, really jacked people walking around gyms, because there's a lot of people doing tons of volume at 7 RIR or little volume past failure or everything in between that. And there's a lot of people not getting results and being really frustrated because they're not getting results. So clearly not everything works. And so then you look at like, on a population level, you look at these results of these studies, and it appears it's like, for the general population, we recommend this because it works. But then you look at the like scatter plot of the individual data points, and it's like, well, yeah, you know, you had one person that responded best to 6 sets, and you had another person that responded best to 28 sets. So yeah, 10 to 20 sets seems like the right number, right? But what if you're that 6 set person or that 28 set person, then 10 to 20 sets doesn't actually work for you. And so this all is like a really long way of getting back to my original point, that if you're working with somebody that has experience, anecdote is your number one thing to start with. What has worked for you? Because if you're that 6 set person, who gives a fuck if 10 to 20 sets is what studies say works best, right? If someone came to me and was like, yeah, I've been getting great gains with 6 sets, well, the first thing I'm going to do is not be like, well, we're going to move you to 12 sets because you at least have to be in the 10 to 20 set range, you know? So anyway, those are just kind of like my main basic points to defend my statement that anecdote is first. And then I think we can go many places from there and even take it into nutrition if you want to.
Yeah, let's take it into nutrition, and then we'll, because I have some notes on some of the things you have here, and then I'll kind of lead into mine, because that's kind of how we have it laid out. I think that makes the most sense.
Okay. Do you want me to jump into nutrition here?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Nice. I see your note underneath my note. Okay. So my thought on diet is that, again, just like I introduced with the training, that the hierarchy of evidence is always in the back of my brain and impossible to separate. But my first inclination is to ask what people's preferences are, understanding, you know, the basics of the laws of thermodynamics and calories in, calories out, and what their goals are, and all these things. But like I just tend to give people the option of whether they prefer the higher fat or the higher carb approach in their process here. And I think that again, in the inability to separate from evidence, I'm going to at some point talk to them about, hey, if you're eating a lot of food, it may be difficult to do so with high fat. If you're trying to go into like a caloric surplus, and here are the benefits of potentially taking a higher carb approach during a deficit, or, here are some cases where maybe you wouldn't want to take a higher carb approach during a deficit. But with enough protein and with the proper manipulation of calories, to me, when you look at the big rocks, that's the big rock. And so to facilitate somebody working closer to their physique goals with maybe less concerns overall about health things. And I would, of course, go into this assuming that the person is generally healthy, that I'm not working with somebody that has, diabetes and telling them to go on a high carb diet or something along those lines. But there's certainly different levels in the pursuit of optimality, and up to a point, personal preference can get you really, really close to optimal when you're taking into account protein and total calories. So that'll be my introduction, and I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, so I agree 100% with what you said about the big rocks, and I really don't see any way that anyone could argue, pretty much otherwise. I think it really, really depends too on, as a coach, your positioning, the populations that you work with, and the ambition of each specific client. I am at a point where a majority, I would say maybe half of my clients they're coming to me for context and nuance specific nutrition, right? Someone's like, Aaron, I want to heat this goal. And I'm like, well, we just got to get calories up there. Doesn't really matter. Split them however you want. They're going to be like, what the fuck? This isn't what I came to you for, right? So, I think it's really, as much as I hate to use this answer, because it does sound like a cop-out, but it's individual specific, right? If we have someone, and this is why one of those things, like whenever you're working with someone, there's assumptions that need to be made, because you are assuming that someone is generally healthy, or that they have, fasting insulin levels, fasting blood glucose levels that are at where they might seem. However, in practicality, I've looked at enough client labs now that I know that that's just not the truth. So for me, and again, with more of the clientele that, come to me, people want to know, people want the specifics, they want the nitty gritty. And I'm like, I love that shit. So I'm like, yeah, let's get labs, right? I encourage all of my clients when they start with me to let's get labs so we know. And if someone's like, hey, Aaron, I want to go in this bulking phase, and they come to me and their fasting blood glucoses are in the like 107s, 110s, 112. I'm like, we can try the higher fat and see, but we probably just need to get these actually down first, find out why they're high. Is it oxidative stress? What does the rest of your diet look like? Or you have, what antioxidants are in your diet, sort of thing. Like, how can we get this down? Because we can gain, obviously you probably picked up on the tone of my voice there, but when these fasting glucose levels are already high, there's already high oxidative stress. That's not an optimal standpoint for increasing muscle mass and tissue from. You're in a dysregulated kind of health standpoint. It would make the most sense to get these back to a good position where you are actually healthy, so that you can respond better. Like our friend Brandon DeCruz always says, a healthy body is a responsive body. So it really depends on like how much you have to look at. But for me, and this is why it's great, because the context of the question is like, how do you guys each approach this? Like, this is how I approach it. So that's the first one in the context of eating up more. And then in the context of calorie deficit, this is why, when I can, right, with my clientele, I am going to take a high protein, high carbohydrate diet and a low fat dietary approach for calorie deficits. And the sole reason pretty much there is volume is a driver of satiety, and high protein, high carb is king for getting more volume in. So something that many people really don't understand is like, even at, let's say 2,500 calories, like, oh, well, I'm hungry because it's 2,500 calories. Like, I can stretch 2,500 calories to the fucking moon and you will be very, very full and satiated. And it's much easier to adhere to a diet over time when you are highly satiated and not having to deal with hunger. And then the last part about that is assuming that we're training for body composition, right? Which is, hypertrophy or doing our best to maintain all of the lean muscle we possibly can during a calorie deficit. If we're leveraging something like metabolic style work, right, to promote glucose uptake and stuff into the cell, a higher carbohydrate diet is going to be better for more time spent above the anaerobic threshold in terms of facilitating the recovery process, right? Using carbohydrate to shut off that cortisol response post-training and that sort of thing. So again, it's the big rock is still the big rock, but then after that big rock, these things can be beneficial when they're used appropriately, again, specific to the context of the individual, the ambition of their goal, right? If you're just trying to go from 30% body fat, I'm speaking about for like a male, to a 20% body fat, everything I said, besides probably the glucose dysregulation and insulin sensitivity one, doesn't really matter, right? Anything's going to work. You just need to focus on health and habits. But going from like a 20 to a 10, all those things start to matter. Can make it easier, I should say. They don't absolutely matter.
Yeah. Hypothetically, what would you say to a client that came to you and they showed you studies demonstrating the benefits of like a keto or paleo style approach? They said that that's their preference, and they said that has worked for them in the past, and maybe to even add to that, maybe they're like a strength athlete. Like they're more of like a power lifter type where it's like work for 12 seconds and rest for 4 minutes type thing. What would be your kind of response or way that you would work through that with them?
So give me the context again. They're
citing studies. They're like, hey, these low carb approaches are better. I have this, and this study because they're out there. I mean, if you want to find studies that support keto, there's endless studies that support keto. So he has studies. He says, I prefer to eat this way, and it's worked for me in the past.
So the initial thing with people that say that I have conversations with, I'm going to say, well, why did it work better in the past? And they'll be like, oh, well, when I have carbs, I get really bloated or something like that. So in that leads me to, it's like the paleo style eating or like the carnivore keto style eating, it removes largely that, which alleviates like that symptom. But it's not that like paleo or keto or carnivore is like magic for you. It's like you have digestive dysregulation and probably some sort of like bacteria overgrowth, which is why you get bloated and all these things happen when you have carbohydrate. So like if you fix that, you can then eat those carbohydrate again. So it's like there's a specific phrase for it. I can't think about it, but it's like that is it's a byproduct of this other problem you have. It's not that paleo, or we keep roping them up, but it's not that like diet X is best for you. It's like you have a problem that is not solved, and that's why these things are producing these issues for you. So that would be like that argument. But if someone's like, Aaron, I want to work with you, but I want to be carnivore, I'm gonna be like, yeah, I'm flattered, but I'm gonna find you like a carnivore coach and then it's a note that I have here, right? And I only know this now from experience, but like I don't play a game that I can't win, right? If I'm not confident that I can help this client reach this goal within the bounds of how they want to reach it, like I'm not going to take that client on. I'm very fortunate in that I have like a network of friends who are coaches in different stuff. Like I send people to different people all the time. Like I got a guy who reached out to me last week. He was very, very green, wanted to like train in his garage with a couple pairs of dumbbells and stuff. And I was like, listen, I'm not the resource for you, but I have a resource for you. And I reached out and connected him with the right coach. And I love that because there's people who are going to be able to do that job better than me. I don't have to be a coach for everyone. I just need to find people a resource. And then the people who I will be a great resource for, I can hit home runs all fucking day.
Yeah, yeah. No, I totally dig that. And I mean, I act the same way with clients regarding training. Like at this point, you know, if someone were to come to me and be like, hey, I want to do bodybuilding, but I also want to compete in like CrossFit competitions 2 to 3 times a year, I'd be like, yeah, let's find you a different coach, you know? So kind of the same idea. But okay, so along the same lines of the keto, paleo, carnivore discussion, like, what do you make of all of the positive research on that? Because I mean, I feel like there's a ton of research that points to that being negative. So you can obviously cite that research and be like, hey, here's where it's blah, 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 1, 2, 3. It's like clearly not good for this goal, whatever. But there's just as much research being like, it is really good for this, and like through this process and this process, we can convert this to this and use this as energy, and like all of these different positive attributes too. So like, what do you make of that research? And like, I know you have your bias, but like, what's your thought process with all this?
Yeah. So so really the hardest and most interesting thing about research is it takes like really, really qualified people to actually break down and understand the quality of that research. And I am very transparent around like, I am not one of those people. In the last like 6 months have I actually started getting much better with like understanding limitations and breaking some things down. But like, obviously research studies are very, very, scientific and stuff like that. I mean, fuck, we should hope so, right? But like the note that you said, they will report like population means, but then there will always be outliers way over and way under, that population mean sort of thing. And oftentimes you want to read, like so many people just read the abstract or something like that and don't look into the testing methods or the sample size, right? Some of these, like I've seen somewhere the sample size is like 4 people. And I'm like, I mean, and it's hard, and I feel like it often sounds like I'm taking the standpoint of like bashing research. It's a really hard gig, like obviously like funding's oftentimes a huge issue. Many times they're only a couple weeks long because you can't expect people to like adhere to this thing over a 12-month period where they're not getting paid or anything like that. Like they're very limited in what you can actually do. And then other times research is funded by a company who wants a specific outcome of it, so I would imagine it's a very hard game. So with that, what I recommend is like digging in. Like it reminds me of, I have a client who, there was some stupid article and it was like basically how eating walnuts is like crushing your testosterone, right? And it linked to this research study. And then the study was in, first of all, the study was in like dogs. And it was in like dogs who were like hypogonadal already. And it was like so far-fetched of what this like, site took and extrapolated it. But yeah, I would say for me, if a study's done in rodents, in vitro, I'm not even paying attention to it. I'm only going to pay attention once I have a human trial that's not in an obese population, right? Because we know from a physiological standpoint, a lot of things are just different when you're talking about an obese population, that if someone's at 15%, those things wouldn't apply as much. Same thing with a lot of the like testosterone boosting supplements, right? If you're hypogonadal because you're stressed the fuck out and you sleep 5 hours per night, one of these testosterone supplements might show 10% improvement. But you know what's going to show you like a 40% improvement? Fucking sleeping and not being super stressed out. So it's like things can work in specific contexts, but they're like leaving out the point that are these larger needle movements. And it's just like you have to unpack a lot of the study to get to that point oftentimes. And it's hard to read it. It really, really is.
As you were saying that, it actually made me think that weight loss studies in obese populations are kind of similar to like training studies in novice populations, where like anything works. So it's really hard to know like very specifically whether it was any one specific thing. It's just everything.
Yeah, exactly. Okay.
Do you have more stuff on here? Yeah.
Yeah, I do have a little bit. So,
Okay.
so I won't really, actually I will. So we actually did cover that. One thing that I said is, you do want to start from like a baseline of evidence, right? Because there are people in extremes who do very, let's say unnecessary things, right? You could take someone and just diet them on just protein and vegetables and not have any carbohydrate, right? Will that work? Yeah, it'll work really, really well. Their life's also kind of miserable. And it's also making this large assumption that they have the adherence of, an iron stone god who has no human qualities, which isn't really true there. So that's where it's really helpful to not get too much into like bro-esque, like the far extremes of like the bro-esque kind of situations. However, when we don't have studies or research on a certain population, right? Where can we look to people who have done what this person wants to do and who have done it consistently, right? We look to the bodybuilding world. I mean, oftentimes some of it's complete BS, but a lot of other times they're just ahead of what the research is able to, prove. And we've known that over, a couple decades now, right? The stuff that people were doing back in the 70s and 80s in terms of like intensity techniques and stuff, we're only now getting the research on why it works and how it works and that sort of thing. And then the last one I had a note about with the training experience is kind of like what you said. When the lower the training age, the simpler things can be because the wider your margins are for success. But then as you get into the advanced training age, right, the body of applicable published research begins to dwindle. So again, we can look at anecdotally who is advanced, right, with a natural training age that's, high, who has really high amounts of muscle mass. You look at your top level natural bodybuilders, right? And what are they doing? That's probably some good anecdote to try and replicate because we have across, multiple people. I'm sure if you look at qualities of people like Berto and some of the other really top big names, and some of these guys it's very, very impressive what they actually look like. Like, how are they training? What are they doing at these parts of their career? Because they're going to be in their 30s, maybe even in their 40s, because it doesn't really happen by the time you're 22, 25. In many cases, in some cases, there are some, even genetic freaks. But okay, they're doing these things. It's probably a decent approach when you don't have a straightforward, evidence-based supported approach to go off of yet.
Yeah, no, it's super well said. And it made me kind of realize as you were talking that I could boil this whole conversation down into essentially saying that the higher your training and your training age and your just like, what's the word? The pursuit of fitness age, because that would encompass nutrition as well. However long you've been pursuing this thing, if it's longer, I tend to default to anecdote and personal preference more. And the lower your training age, the more I tend to default to evidence. And whichever one is the priority, depending on your experience age, the other ones are still included. It's just that they're thought about more as like the background, and the other one becomes the more prominent feature. So yeah, I think that would be like the way that through this conversation, I've kind of gotten that clarity in the way that I would diagnose that. And I think that works pretty well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to wrap it up. Like the more green you are, the larger that you can really lean on the evidence, because there is the more of that population that has been studied that you fit within. The more you get into an extreme end of not many people from a population standpoint have been there, the more you're going to have to lean on anecdote from people who have already gotten there. That's a really, really good way to put it.
Yeah, they have the experience. So, I mean, like, there's a reason you're where you are, and it's probably not because you've been following evidence. And if you were, if you have that person, you're like, yeah, I've been following evidence only for the last 15 years, then you're like, hey, that's your anecdote, bro. Like, your anecdote is that the evidence works for you. So there you go.
Yep. Anything else you want to add on this episode, Bryan?
No, I got 3 hours till the photo shoot. Time to go eat some rice cakes. And then I got a Dutch apple pie and a big tub of vanilla ice cream. And so this afternoon, that shit is going down. And yeah, I'm going to take a week or so and just kind of enjoy food and then, get back to being smart and move forward from there. So
is the lactose going to bother you at all, do you think?
Probably not. I mean... Okay. A little bit. Like, so for me, it's milk. Like, if I drink milk, I really get messed up. Mm-hmm. But like pizza and ice cream, I can handle in like small to moderate doses and be fine.
Okay. Yeah. All right. I was just interested in that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would.
I mean, it's like 8 to 12 ounces of milk is kind of like a lot of lactose, mm-hmm. but a scoop of ice cream or like a couple pieces of pizza isn't really.
Yeah, it's not nearly.
And to be honest, isn't pizza casein mostly because it's cheese?
The different cheeses have varying amounts of lactose in them. A really, really good way. This is a nice little anecdote for the listeners, tidbit. The softer cheese, like a cottage cheese, is like very soft. The softer the cheese, the higher the lactose. And then once you get into your harder cheeses like cheddar and, I really don't know my cheeses because I don't eat it, but they have less lactose. So if you're ever if you are sensitive to lactose, right? Cottage cheese is going to fuck you up, right? Like a cheddar or like a provolone or I don't even know, harder ones, sharper cheeses are generally safer because they have less lactose.
I would guess that mozzarella is probably like a 50-50 mix, which is like the common pizza cheese, but I'll have to look that up.
Yeah. Cool.
Well, yeah, I'm going to do that, and then that'll be fun. And then we leave for Wisconsin on Thursday. I didn't put that in my updates, but 2 days after recording this, 5 days after this episode drops, or 5 days before this episode drops, we'll be driving to Wisconsin. So I have 2 days of travel, and that'll be the end of my deload. And then this weekend, July 2nd or 3rd, I'll probably start my new training cycle.
Are we taking a break from the podcast next week while you're in Wisconsin?
No, I'm planning on bringing my microphone and camera and continuing to do it as I did in San Diego. So I'll just have to remember that that'll be 7 a.m. Wisconsin time instead of 6 a.m. Colorado time, but it should be the same for you.
All right, you guys heard it. Eat, Train, Prosper will have a fresh episode out next week while Bryan is on vacation with his family. All right, guys, so thanks for listening as always. Yep. Bryan and I will officially talk to you next week.